Hey guys! Tonight, I want you to just lean back, maybe dim the lights, and settle in. We're going to spend a very long time talking about things that probably shouldn't have happened, but definitely did. Because history is nothing if not a series of poor decisions and biological glitches. Tonight, we're looking at one of the most bizarre cases of why is this happening to ever grace the medical journals of the 1700s. We're talking about Tarrare. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, and he certainly wasn't a saint. He was just a guy who was very, very hungry. So get comfortable, find a nice spot to drift off, and let's talk about the man who quite literally tried to eat the world. To understand Tarrare, we have to go back to rural France in the 1770s. Now, usually when we talk about 18th century France, we're thinking about powdered wigs, revolutionary guillotines, and Marie Antoinette being misunderstood. But out in the countryside, life was a bit more earthy. Around 1772, a boy was born who would eventually be known only as Tarrare. We don't actually know his real name. Tarrare was likely a nickname, possibly derived from the French expression bonbon Tarrare, which was used to describe big explosions or loud noises, which honestly, considering his digestive situation later in life, is a bit of a low-hanging fruit in terms of naming conventions. As a child, Tarrare was, by all accounts, normal-looking. He wasn't a giant, he wasn't a monster. He was just a teenager with an appetite that would make a competitive eater today look like they were on a restrictive cleanse. By the time he hit his teens, Tarrare was reportedly eating a quarter of a beef carcass every single day. That is not a typo, a quarter of a cow, daily. His parents, who were presumably not made of money or infinite livestock, eventually did what any sensible, overwhelmed 18th century peasants would do. They kicked him out. They just couldn't afford the grocery bill anymore. And honestly, relatable. So Tarrare finds himself wandering the French countryside. He's a teenager, he's homeless, and he's possessed by a hunger that feels like a literal physical weight. He falls in with a gang of traveling harlots and thieves, which is a classic career move for the era. He learned to use his talent to survive. He became a street performer. People would gather around to watch this thin, scruffy young man swallow things that were decidedly not food. We're talking about stones, live animals, and even baskets of apples, swallowed whole, one after another, like a wood chipper. The description of Tarrare's physical appearance during these years is where things get truly sleepless. He was incredibly thin. He supposedly weighed only about 100 pounds at the age of 17, despite eating enough to fuel a small army. He had a mouth that was, and I'm being polite here, unusually large. When he hadn't eaten, his skin hung in loose folds around his midsection. He could take the skin from his stomach and wrap it almost all the way around his waist. He also had these massive, floppy cheeks. When he ate, these cheeks would puff out like a bellows, and his stomach would distend until it looked like a huge, hard balloon. And then there was the smell. Doctors who later studied him noted that Tarrare smelled so bad that you couldn't stand within 20 paces of him. It was a fetid odor that supposedly got worse after he ate. He would sweat profusely, and a visible vapor, yes, a literal steam, would rise off his body. He was, in every sense of the word, a human furnace that was constantly burning through fuel and producing some very unfortunate exhaust. Eventually, the nomadic life of a street performer got a bit old, or maybe the stones started sitting heavy, because Tarrare headed to Paris. This was around the start of the War of the First Coalition. Being a young man of military age, and seeing as the army provided consistent rations, Tarrare joined the French Revolutionary Army. This was a catastrophic mistake for everyone involved. You see, the French army rations were designed for normal humans. They were meant to sustain a soldier through a long march, not a biological anomaly. Tarrare was given the standard ration, which he finished in about 30 seconds. And then he proceeded to do chores for every other soldier in his unit in exchange for their scraps. He scoured the gutters. He ate refuse. He was still starving. He ended up in the military hospital at Sulz with a case of extreme exhaustion, because turns out, when you burn calories like a jet engine, a piece of dry bread and some soup isn't going to cut it. At the hospital, he came under the care of two men who were about to become very obsessed with him, Dr. Corville and the chief surgeon, George Didier. They were fascinated. They decided to see just what Tarrare was capable of. This is where the story shifts from sad, hungry boy to medical fever dream. They brought him a meal intended for 15 German laborers. The table was piled with 2 large meat pies, plates of grease and fat, and 4 gallons of milk. Tarrare, being the polite guest that he was, ate the entire thing immediately, and then he went to sleep. The doctors noticed that while he was eating, he seemed to lose his mind a bit. His eyes would get bloodshot, he'd start sweating that weird steam again, and he became entirely focused on the task at hand. He wasn't picky either. They once presented him with a live cat. Now, if you're a cat lover, you might want to drift off for a second here. Tarrare took the cat, bit its stomach open, drank its blood, and then ate the entire thing, fur, bones, and all, leaving only the pelt. He did the same with dogs, lizards, and eels. He once swallowed an entire live eel without chewing, which you have to admire the commitment to the bit, if nothing else. Dr. Corville, however, had a brilliant idea. Instead of just watching Tarrare eat the hospital's entire budget, why not use him for the war effort? This was the era of the French Revolution. Spies were everywhere. General Alexandre de Beauharnais decided they could use Tarrare as a courier. The plan was simple. Tarrare would swallow a wooden box containing a secret message, walk through enemy lines, and then, well, retrieve the box once he reached the other side. They tested it first. They put a note inside a wooden cylinder, had Tarrare swallow it, and waited. When the cylinder returned to the world of the living, the note was still legible. Success! Tarrare was given his first mission. He was to head into Prussian territory to deliver a message to a captured French colonel. His reward? A wheelbarrow full of raw bull's lungs, truly a king's ransom for a man of his tastes. But Tarrare wasn't a spy. He was a starving man in a colorful uniform who smelled like a landfill. He was immediately captured by the Prussians. They searched him, found nothing, but eventually they grew suspicious of this man who was clearly not a soldier. They whipped him, they threatened him, and eventually Tarrare broke. He confessed the whole plan. They chained him to a latrine and waited for the delivery. When the wooden box finally appeared, the Prussian general, Zogli, opened it with great anticipation, expecting high-level military secrets. Instead, the note inside just asked the colonel to confirm if the message had been delivered and to send back any useful information. It was a dummy note. The French generals didn't even trust Tarrare with real secrets yet. They were just testing him. The Prussians were understandably annoyed. They gave Tarrare a mock execution, basically putting a noose around his neck and then letting him go at the last second, then beat him and dumped him back at the French lines. Tarrare, having had quite enough of the spy life, crawled back to the hospital begging Dr. Didier to cure him of his hunger. He was desperate. He tried everything the 18th century had to offer. He took wine vinegar, he took tobacco pills, he took large quantities of laudanum. Nothing worked. If anything, he got hungrier. He started sneaking out of the hospital at night to eat refuse behind butcher shops. He fought stray dogs for bones in the alleys. Most disturbingly, he was caught several times trying to enter the hospital's mortuary to, well, let's just say he was looking for a snack that didn't require cooking. The breaking point came when a 14-month-old baby disappeared from the hospital. Now, there was no proof Tarrare did it, but given his track record with cats, dogs, and anything else that moved, the hospital staff wasn't taking any chances. They chased him out. Tarrare vanished into the night, a hungry ghost in the streets of France. He popped up again 4 years later in Versailles, dying of tuberculosis. He was still hungry, but his body was finally failing. When he died, the autopsy was so revolting that the lead surgeon nearly fainted. His insides were a mess of pus and massive, oversized organs. His stomach was so large it covered almost all of his abdominal cavity. His gallbladder was enormous. His liver was, well, It was a disaster. And that's the end of Tarrare, a man who lived a life of constant, gnawing void. He was a medical mystery, a failed spy, and a warning that sometimes the human body just decides to go its own way. So, we've just finished with Tarrare, a man who was essentially a human black hole. It's a bit of a hard act to follow, I know. But if we're talking about biological anomalies and things that probably should have been stopped by a sensible adult, we have to talk about the Habsburgs. If Tarrare was a glitch in a single human body, the Habsburgs were a glitch in the entire concept of European royalty. Let's float over to Central Europe, where for several centuries, one family decided that the best way to keep power was to never, ever look for a spouse further than the end of the dinner table. You've probably heard of the Habsburg jaw. It's the ultimate historical oops. But to understand how we got to the point where a king couldn't chew his own food, we have to look at the philosophy of the Casa de Austria. Their motto was essentially, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. They married cousins, they married nieces. They married people who were so closely related that their family tree eventually looked less like a tree and more like a very confused sourdough starter. The poster child for this genetic DIY project is, of course, Charles II of Spain. Now, poor Charles. He was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear that the happy marriage strategy had hit a wall, a very thick inbred wall. To give you an idea of the math here, a normal person has 8 great-grandparents. Because of the way the Habsburgs operated, Charles only had 6. His mother was also his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. At this point, the family reunions weren't just awkward, they were a biological crime scene. Charles was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because in the 17th century, if a king couldn't speak until he was 4, couldn't walk until he was 8, and had a jaw so oversized that his top and bottom teeth didn't meet, people didn't say, hey, maybe we should stop marrying our cousins. They said, clearly, a literal demon has cursed this child. It's a classic move. Blame the supernatural for your own refusal to use a dating app outside of your immediate bloodline. Charles's jaw was so pronounced that he drooled constantly. He couldn't chew his food, so he basically just swallowed everything whole, a bit like a much less successful Tarrare. He was also frequently ill. He had intestinal problems, he was prone to hallucinations, and he was, quite tragically, the end of the line. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent centuries trying to keep their blood pure, and they succeeded so well that the blood basically stopped working. But Charles wasn't an isolated incident. The jaw was a family heirloom. Take Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a contemporary of Charles and had the same protruding lower lip. There's a famous story that when it rained, Leopold had to be careful because his lip would catch the water like a small, flushy gutter. He was a deeply religious man, very cultured, loved music, but he looked like he was perpetually trying to win a pull the funniest face contest without actually trying. The irony here is that the Habsburgs were obsessed with their status. They were the defenders of the faith, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, the masters of the New World. And yet, they were physically falling apart. It's that classic historical contrast. The most powerful people in the room are also the ones most likely to trip over their own genetic heritage. And we can't forget the women of the dynasty. Usually, history focuses on the kings, but the princesses were the ones being shipped off to continue the cycle. Take Mariana of Austria. She was originally supposed to marry the son of Philip IV of Spain, but then the son died. So Philip, who was her uncle, decided, well, I'm a widower, I need an heir, why let a perfectly good alliance go to waste, and he married her himself. She was 15, he was 44, and they were again very closely related. When Mariana arrived in Madrid, she was reportedly shocked by the somber, rigid etiquette of the Spanish court. She liked to laugh, which was apparently a big no-no for a Spanish queen. Once, she laughed at a court jester, and her husband sternly reminded her that a queen of Spain has no sense of humor, which honestly sounds like the tagline for the world's most depressing sitcom. The result of this marriage was, of course, the aforementioned Charles II. It's a cycle of why are we doing this that lasted for hundreds of years. They were trying to preserve the greatness, but they were actually just concentrating the flaws. Think about the psychological toll of this. You're a Habsburg prince. You grow up surrounded by portraits of your ancestors, and every single one of them has the same face, the same heavy jaw, the same pale skin, the same melancholic eyes. It must have been like living in a hall of mirrors where the mirrors are slightly warped. You're told you're a semi-divine being chosen by God to rule, but you also have a chronic stomach ache and you can't close your mouth all the way. The Habsburgs are a perfect example of what happens when the ego of a dynasty outweighs the common sense of basic biology. They were so afraid of losing a province or a title to a rival family that they preferred to slowly dissolve from the inside out. Eventually, the Spanish branch died with Charles II in 1900. He died at 38, looking like an old man, childless and broken. His autopsy was just as grim as Tarrare's. The physician famously said his body did not contain a single drop of blood, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. It's a bit of a buzzkill for a royal legacy, isn't it? You spend 200 years building an empire, only for the medical report to describe you as a collection of spoiled groceries. But don't worry, the Austrian branch of the family kept going for a while longer. They eventually realized that maybe marrying a second cousin was better than an aunt, and the jaw slowly started to recede into the background of history. But the damage was done. The Habsburg jaw remains the gold standard for what happens when you decide that the family tree shouldn't have any branches. Let's take a breath here. Maybe adjust your pillow. We've covered the man who ate everything and the family that married everyone. It's a lot of biological ambition. But the weirdness of the elite doesn't stop with jaws and appetites. Next, I want to take you to a different kind of royal disaster, one that involves less inbreeding, but a lot more, let's call it, eccentricity. We're going to talk about a king who was so obsessed with tall soldiers that he essentially turned his kingdom into a giant high-stakes scouting agency. So we've looked at the Habsburgs, who were obsessed with keeping their DNA in a very tight, very messy circle. But now let's drift north to Prussia, where we find a king who had a very different kind of obsession. This wasn't about bloodlines, it was about height, specifically very tall men in very tall hats. Meet Frederick William I of Prussia. He's often overshadowed by his son, Frederick the Great, who was a genius general and a flute-playing philosopher. But Frederick William, the soldier king, was a different breed entirely. He was a man of simple tastes. He liked his pipe, he liked his beer, he liked fiscal responsibility, and he absolutely loved giants. He created a regiment known as the Potsdam Giants, or more formally, the Langer Kurla, the tall guys. Now, usually when a king builds an elite regiment, it's for winning wars or looking intimidating during a parade. But for Frederick William, this was more like a high-stakes, extremely expensive doll collection. He didn't actually want to use them in battle. They were too precious. He once said, "The most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness." To get into this exclusive club, you had to be at least 6 feet tall. Now today, that's just a point of pride on a dating profile. But in the early 1700s, when the average height was much lower due to poor nutrition and a general lack of vitamins, being 6 feet tall made you a literal giant. But Frederick William didn't just wait for tall men to apply, because why wait for nature to provide when you can just take? He started kidnapping people. He'd send recruiters across Europe to find tall men and just snatch them. There's a story of a tall Italian priest who was snatched while saying mass, and a tall Irishman who was kidnapped while just minding his own business.
He even tried to breed them. He'd find the tallest woman he could and force her to marry his tallest soldier, hoping to create a race of Prussian supergiants. Because, as we've learned from the Habsburgs, playing God with genetics always goes exactly as planned. Spoiler, it didn't. Most of the children were average height, and the parents were just, understandably, very annoyed. The life of a Potsdam giant was weird. They were paid incredibly well and they lived in luxury, but they were essentially prisoners. They were dressed in these massive, towering blue uniforms with even taller hats to make them look even more imposing. And what did they do all day? Did they train for war? Not really. The king would use them as a cure for his depression. When he was feeling low, he would have a couple of hundred of his giants march through his bedroom to cheer him up. He even had a special machine, a rack essentially, to try and stretch men who were almost tall enough but not quite there. He'd supervise the stretching personally while eating his lunch. Naturally, this didn't make them taller, it just broke their joints and made them very, very grumpy. He was so obsessed that he'd trade anything for a tall man. He once traded a collection of rare, priceless porcelain to the King of Poland for a handful of tall soldiers. He also sent tall man scouts to the funeral of a particularly tall man to see if they could somehow, well, let's just say they were very interested in his younger brothers. The irony is that Frederick William was a miserly man. He saved every penny, he hated luxury, and he made his family live on bread and cabbage. But when it came to his giants, the checkbook was wide open. He spent millions of dollars on his collection. It was the one area where he allowed himself to be completely, ridiculously extravagant. When he died, his son Frederick the Great looked at this regiment of 8-foot-tall men who had never seen a day of combat and basically said, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen." He didn't get rid of them immediately, but he diverted their funding into, an actual army that did actual army things. It's a strange chapter in history, isn't it? A man who was terrified of wasting money but would spend a fortune to watch tall men walk in circles in his bedroom. It's that particular brand of royal madness, the kind that comes when you have too much power and a very specific, very odd hobby. But speaking of odd hobbies and royal madness, we should probably move on to someone who took eccentricity to a much darker, more isolated level. Let's drift away from the parades of Prussia and head toward the fairy tale castles of Bavaria. Because if we're talking about royals who lived in their own heads, we have to talk about Ludwig II. Part 4. The Fairy Tale King Who Lost the Plot. So, we've moved from the literal hunger of Tarrare through the genetic hunger for power with the Habsburgs and into the strange vertical hunger of the Soldier King. But now, I want us to drift into a different kind of obsession altogether. We're heading to the mid-1800s, to the snow-capped mountains of Bavaria, to meet a man who was perhaps too beautiful and too poetic for the world he was born into. Let's talk about Ludwig II of Bavaria. You might know him as Mad King Ludwig, or perhaps you've seen a picture of his most famous creation, Neuschwanstein Castle, the one that looks so much like a Disney palace that Disney actually copied it. Ludwig was born in 1845, and from the start he was a bit of an outlier. He was stunningly handsome, tall, dark-haired, with dreamy, sensitive eyes. He was the Swan King. But Ludwig wasn't interested in the gritty reality of 19th century politics. He hated Munich. He hated the stuffy ministers and the boring paperwork of statecraft. Ludwig wanted to live in the Middle Ages. He wanted to live in the operas of Richard Wagner. He wanted to be a king of legend, not a king of constitutional bureaucracy. Of course, because he was a king, he had the budget to try and make his daydreams a reality. While other monarchs were investing in railroads and factories, Ludwig was pouring every cent of the royal treasury and then millions more in personal debt into building castles that served absolutely no military or political purpose. They were just stage sets for his soul. He built Linderhof, which was like a mini Versailles hidden in the woods, featuring a Venus grotto where he would sit in a golden boat shaped like a swan and listen to opera singers perform while he floated in the dark. Because why just listen to a CD when you can build a subterranean lake and hire a professional tenor? But the masterpiece was Neuschwanstein. It's perched on a jagged cliff, a white limestone fantasy of towers and turrets. Inside, it was a shrine to Wagner's operas, Lohengrin, Tannhauser, Parsifal. The walls were covered in murals of knights and dragons. But here's the thing. Ludwig didn't want guests. He didn't want court life. He lived there in almost total isolation. He became a night owl, a literal sleepless historian of his own life. He'd sleep during the day and rise at dusk. He'd take elaborate midnight sleigh rides through the Bavarian Alps, wrapped in heavy furs, his horse's bells jingling in the freezing air. He'd travel from castle to castle in the dark, avoiding the gaze of his subjects. He was a man who lived in a moonlit world of his own making. As he got older, the swans started to fade. He lost his teeth, reportedly because of a massive sweet tooth and a refusal to see a dentist, which made him self-conscious about his appearance. He became increasingly paranoid and eccentric. He'd host dinner parties for invisible guests, talking to the ghosts of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette as if they were sitting right there in his dining hall. He'd have his servants dress in historical costumes and bow to him as if he were an absolute monarch of the 17th century. His ministers, understandably, were starting to sweat. Bavaria was losing its independence to the growing German Empire, and their king was busy ordering a mechanical flying machine shaped like a peacock. They needed a way to get him off the throne before he bankrupted the entire country. So, in 1886, they sent a team of doctors to declare him insane. The official report was a bit of a hatchet job. Most of the doctors hadn't even examined him in person. They just collected stories from disgruntled servants about his midnight rides and his invisible dinner guests. They cornered him at Neuschwanstein, took him into custody, and moved him to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. What happened next is one of history's great "wait, what?" moments. A day after arriving at Berg, Ludwig went for a walk with his psychiatrist, Dr. Gudden. They never came back. Later that night, both men were found dead in the shallow waters of the lake. The official story was that Ludwig committed suicide by drowning and the doctor died trying to save him. But the water was only waist deep. Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and there were reports of bruises on the doctor's head. Some say it was an escape attempt gone wrong. Others say it was a state-sponsored assassination. It was a tragic, murky end for a man who just wanted to live in a fairy tale. And the ultimate irony? Neuschwanstein, the castle that nearly ruined Bavaria's finances, was opened to the public just weeks after his death. Today, it brings in millions of tourists and more money than Ludwig ever spent on it. The Mad King ended up being the best investment the state ever made. But Ludwig wasn't the only royal who struggled with the crushing weight of expectation and the weirdness of the crown. Let's float away from the snowy Alps and head back in time a bit, to the English court, where we'll find a queen who was arguably just as tragic, but for much more biological reasons.